Greetings to all brothers and sisters, whichever part of the world that you are located. My name is Lisiba and I will be presenting Daniel chapter 1 to you with the hope of presenting also chapter 2, chapter 3, all the way up to chapter 4 of the book of Daniel. So without further delay, shall we open the Bible with the word of prayer. Father God, we come before you at this time. We want to thank you for your mercies and your grace. We want to thank you that you are present with us. Though we do not recognize your time, may you open our eyes, may you open our hearts that we might be receptive to the message that you intend on sharing with us at this time. May you be the one leading and guiding us and opening our hearts towards being receptive to what you have in store for us. All this we pray in the mighty and wonderful name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Amen. So, brothers and sisters, without further delay, as I said, my name is Lisiba. So the intention here is to cover the book of Daniel as a whole, and giving some insight in terms of prophecy, in terms of where we are right now at this time, and how actually Daniel prophesied of the events that are taking place in our day today, going forward, and how this world is actually going to come to an end. So without further delay, maybe let's just begin from where we talk about Daniel when before he was deported to the land of Babylon under the king Nebuchadnezzar. So let's talk about the background of Daniel, of who Daniel is, and how other writers view Daniel as a person, as a character. So maybe shall we open our Bibles to the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel 14. Yes, Ezekiel 14, beginning from verses 19 and 20. It reads as follows: Or if I send a pestilence into that land and pour out my fury upon it in blood, to cut off from it man and beast. Verse 20, though Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, as I live, saith the Lord God, shall they deliver neither son nor daughter. They shall deliver only their own souls by their righteousness. So we see that Ezekiel here is writing, and he has a message that he's communicating, that God is giving Ezekiel a message to communicate. But now there are three characters that are mentioned in the Bible, which is Noah, Daniel, and Job, which this testifies to their what? To their righteousness. So because God is saying, if I were to destroy the land, if I were to destroy the beasts, these three individuals, because of their own righteousness, they won't save other people, because they were upright in the sight of the Lord, and God was pleased with these people. That's how pleased God was with these people. So he will save these people by their own righteousness, not to say their righteousness that they have crafted for themselves or they have concocted for themselves, but a righteousness that they believed in God, that they held on to what God had said. They were faithful to God. Job will remember that he was faithful until the point where he got sick. I mean, even Satan himself wanted the life of Job, but God did not allow that to happen. Noah himself, he built the ark of God for many years. He built the ark so that him and his family and those that actually believed in God would be saved through the very same ark. So we see the very same thing in Daniel. We see Daniel, if we maybe jump ahead of time right now, we see Daniel in the lion's den. We also see him in the fiery furnace. So we see the faithfulness of these individuals that Ezekiel is talking about in this passage of scripture. Let's maybe read another one in the very same book of Ezekiel. Let's go to Ezekiel 28. Ezekiel 28 verses 3. Ezekiel 28 verses 3. It says, Behold, thou art wiser than Daniel, there is no secret that they can hide from thee. This is now the king of Tyre. There's a message that comes to the king of Tyre, and we can understand that the very same chapter actually is a chapter concerning the king of Tyre and how God is taking this king of Tyre and speaking through to him as if he were Satan. So this king exemplifies who? Satan. So now God is saying to this king of Tyre that, behold, thou art wiser than who? Than Daniel. So now if that is the case and God is comparing both of them, it tells us about the character of Daniel. It tells us about the uprightness of Daniel at his time. So even our Messiah tells us about who? About Daniel at a later stage. He tells us about Daniel in Matthew 24, Matthew 24, verse 15 and 16. We also look at the very same portion of scripture in the book of Mark. We also see the very same thing in the book of Luke, where actually Jesus himself, he says to his disciples when they were talking about what? About the temple. They were talking about the end of the age, and God, our Christ, refers them back to the book of Daniel. And it says, when you shall therefore see the abomination of desolation stand in the holy place, spoken of by the prophet Daniel, let him who read what? Understand. So God is also referring us and his disciples at the time to say, go to the book of Daniel. So it means that Daniel himself had something to do with the end times, had something to do with prophecy in general, because God himself says by the prophet Daniel. So we see that in the very same on the very same token that Daniel himself was an upright man, was a righteous man. So but now another thing, going a bit further before we even jump into the book of Daniel, we see that there was a prophecy concerning the destruction of Jerusalem even before Daniel comes upon the scene. So Daniel comes from a place where there were prophecies about Jerusalem and that Jerusalem wouldn't stand forever. So Daniel comes from that background where he was reading books of other prophets as well. So he was a man not only of an upright character, but that upright character was formed by study. He was a student of prophecy himself. So God was using him. God ended up using him at a later stage to prophesy for his children. And so we see that Daniel was very instrumental, and so God had decided to use him because of his what? Of his character. So now, with that in mind, let us look at the book of Jeremiah 25, where the prophecy was actually made by Jeremiah in his book Jeremiah chapter 25. Jeremiah chapter 25. Let's go there. Jeremiah 25, beginning at verses 8 to 11. We are reading. Therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts, because ye have not heard my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, saith the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land, and against its inhabitants, and against all these nations round about, and will utterly destroy them, and make them an horror, and hissing, and perpetual desolation. Consider that word, because we are going to touch upon that word at a later time in our series. So consider that word, a perpetual desolation. Verse 10. Moreover, I will take from them the voice of man, and the voice of gladness, and the voice of the bridegroom, and the voice of the bride, and the sound of the milestones, and the light of the Lamb. Verse 11. And this whole land shall be a desolation. Once again, that word shall be a desolation and an horror, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. So that's what we are looking at. This is where now Daniel was reading from, where before he went into captivity in the land of Babylon under the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar. So 70 years were determined. Jeremiah prophesied about this that the nation shall serve other gods. They shall be under the kingship or rulership of another kingdom, which here it's plain. It says Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. So God is actually here says my servant, saying Nebuchadnezzar, my servant. So now it is plain that God had actually used a pagan kingdom to discipline his own children. So we come to see that Daniel himself was reading through the prophets that he was coming from. So immediately we can see that Daniel, his material can be tested on the basis of other prophets that came before him. He did not just conjure up things out of nowhere and he was isolated as a prophet, but we realize that he was also interconnected with all these other prophets, with Ezekiel as well. So we see that he was a person who was a student of God's word. Another point that I would like to mention and raise is the three different deportations that took place. And mind you, that number is very important, and it will be important to us as we go further in terms of our study and our material. So right now, the three deportations that we are talking about is when Jerusalem was captured by the Babylonians, by King Nebuchadnezzar to be more specific, into the land of Babylon. The first king that came on the scene was King Jehoiakim, king of Judah, who reigned from 606 BC. And then the second king that came was the son of Jehoiakim, which his name was Jehoiakim, which reigned from 597 BC. And the third king that came that ruled over the children of God is Zedekiah, who reigned until 586 BC. So now Daniel was in the first of that deportations. In other words, he was in the first capturing of Jerusalem. So he was one of the first group that went into Babylon. So with that, now Daniel was now in Babylon for more than 70 years. He spent most of his life that side. Actually, Daniel died even later on. He was an old man when he died. So now, with Daniel having grown that old, so he has a lot of history in terms of being in Babylon, and there's a lot of events that are taking place in Babylon where actually Daniel has played a big role, and as we shall get to see that. As a matter of fact, let us go and the issue of the deportations. The Bible tells us in the book of Daniel, if we can go to the book of Daniel, the last couple of verses of chapter 1, since we are focusing on chapter 1 in this presentation. So let us look into the last verses of this the last verses of chapter 1. Yes, and it says here, and Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. So Daniel himself, actually, as we'll come to discover, that he saw Babylon, we can fairly say, from the time that King Nebuchadnezzar started ruling the kingdom of Babylon. Because firstly, earlier on, King Nebuchadnezzar ruled as co-regent, if I can put it that way, or he ruled conjointly with his father Nabopolassar. So he ruled 2 years before he ruled alone. That was when his father died later on. But he ruled 2 years in the kingdom with his father, and then later on started ruling over Babylon on his own. So Daniel mostly saw the events that took place in the land of Babylon, and he continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. That is Daniel 1 21, the last verse of that chapter. So now continuing, if maybe we can proceed in terms of reading the narration of what is happening here. So we haven't really got into the prophecies as yet, but we are looking just at the background, the historical background as to where Daniel comes into play, where Daniel came from before he even got himself, he saw himself in the kingdom of Babylon, and his lifestyle really, because chapter 1 gives us a background to his life, and when he starts his ministry, how does he go about it, and how does God actually has his provisions for Daniel and his he was not alone, by the way. He was with his couple of his friends that were deported in the same time in the first deportation with Daniel. So when I'm talking about deportations, another thing to add before I even continue, we are talking about how the capturing of Jerusalem, or the deported. How many times were they deported? That's what we are talking about. They were deported 3 times. There were 3 deportations. So the first deportation, there was a bit of an agreement that the king Jehoiakim at the time had with the king of Babylon, which is Nebuchadnezzar. So that agreement allowed him to have a bit of freedom and autonomy here and there. So when he rebelled, or when the nation rebelled, now the king of Babylon came the second time, and he besieged the city again. And the first time or the second time when he came, he dealt with them more harshly than he dealt with them the second time. So now he comes the third time under the king who? Zedekiah. So this is now when he completely annihilates everything. He takes the vessels and he deals with them more harshly than he did in the first and the second time. So every time the disagreement, or the rebellious nature of the Israelites caused the king to act more harshly every time. So he gave them more strict regulations. So they had to perform whatever that they needed to perform under strict and much stringent or strong regulations than he had came the first time. So let us read here in the first verse. Actually, the very same thing that we just alluded to is mentioned. It says, now in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels and the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. This is now the king of Babylon, talking about how he took over the city, how he took over Jerusalem, and took the vessels and part of the house of Jerusalem to the house of his God. This is now in Babylon. So he took the very same sacred items or vessels that they were held dearly by the Israelites, and he took them to his what? To his gods. And this was a bit of a sort of a trophy, a show of, if you will, that they had gained victory over their enemies. So yes, that is the background that we're coming from. And we come to read also that not only that, but there were other portions where Hezekiah was told, I think in 2nd Kings, he was told that his descendants, or his children, meaning descendants, were to be taken captive into a foreign land. And all these treasures and all these good things that you see in this house, talking about the very same vessels, would be taken and they would be used as trophies in the house of their foreign gods. Let us proceed. Maybe if we can read a bit of this chapter, giving us a background of what Daniel is, who Daniel was, and how Daniel navigates while he's in the kingdom of Babylon. Let's read maybe chapter verse 3. It says, and the king spoke unto Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, youths in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom and gifted in knowledge and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. So we see also a very important aspect here. We see that the king, um, to a certain extent, had a bit of an understanding, and he didn't want to only limit his advisories to those of his own nation, but there was something that intrigued him, probably about what? About the Israelites, and hence he wanted others from the very same nation, from that he could raise, that he could teach his own language, as it says. That he would teach the culture. He would, people, youth that what, that had knowledge in various subjects, that were had the ability to learn, and so he wanted to develop these young men so that they could actually be advisors to his kingdom. They would explore his kingdom, that they would help in some way, form or shape, in terms of what, advising him in terms of how he should rule his own kingdom. Now, upon that, in as much as those good intentions were there, it appears when we read verse 7, and it reads as follows: Unto the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar, and Hananiah, Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and Azariah of Abednego. So he changed their names. So he brings them, he changed their names, and because now we come to realize that even the names of these people have a what, a significance in their own culture, in their own tradition, in their own what, religion, in their own faith. So he changes these names from what they are in their culture to what he wants them to be in his own culture. He changes them to the language of the what, of the Chaldeans. So these names now they change um, to resemble what, pagan gods, because they do have their meaning. And maybe just to look into one of those names, if we can quickly look into those names. Belteshazzar means the prince of Bel, which is a pagan god. And we look at Shadrach, which is the servant of sin, which is the moon god. So we can look at others as well, which mean resemble pagan gods, which is the moon god and things like that. So he changes their names to fit his kingdom. Probably he didn't want to hear the names of their true god being called in his kingdom. Maybe he wanted to change their identity, but still have them intact in terms of mind, body, and spirit, to do his purpose and to advise him. We don't know really, but he changed their names. They come into a new kingdom, and he probably wants to show that he is in power. He wants to exert his power so that they understand that he is the one who has what? Who has absolute authority in this very same kingdom. We are reading on. Let's focus on chapter 1, verse 8 at this time. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's food, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel in favor with the brought in favor and compassion with the prince of the eunuchs. So we see here also another development that is taking place. So Daniel had purposed in his heart, because he was a man of a different faith. He comes and he says in his heart, you know what, in as much as we are here in a foreign land, but I cannot give up my faith. And he purposed in his heart to say, I won't give up my faith, but I finish this thing within me to say, I'm going to stand for the true God that I know, that I worship. Because in as much as we can say the nation has rebelled, not necessarily that everyone has rebelled that entire nation. It just means that the structures, the governing structures, have actually rebelled against the kingdom of God. They have went away. They have failed to do that which God has called them to do. So we shall also see in later studies as well that though the structures of churches might fall, but there are individuals that are not probably the main structure, they do not form the main structure of the church, or an organization for that matter, that actually do make it, that do survive in all difficulty because of what? Of their understanding of the time of where they live in. So it's the very same case with Daniel here. So he didn't want to give up his faith entirely, and he couldn't give up his faith entirely. He had to stand true to the God that he was introduced to, and keep the very same faith because he grew up under the very same faith. So he purposed in his heart to say, I will not defile myself, but instead I will make this vessel by God's grace to what? To work for the kingdom. So he purposed in his heart to say, you know what, I won't defile myself. And as we read on, maybe we can jump on to, let's say, verse 10. It says, and the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your food and your drink, for why should he see your faces worse looking than the youths who are of your age? Then shall ye make me endanger my head with the king. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Verse 12, test thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. So this is what Daniel had said to Melzar, which was the leader who was appointed to look after them during their stay as trainees for that 3 years. So Daniel had finished this thing in his heart. So he comes with the way. God provides him with the wisdom, and he comes up with the way of approaching this person to say, you know what, this is what I would want to do. And mainly what we are looking at, he said, Daniel says to Melzar, give us vegetables, give us pulse to eat, give us water to drink. We do not want to eat the meat of the king. We do not want to drink the wine that the king has to drink. So but if you give us just a simple diet, we will do just fine. And one of the reasons is that when we come to realize where Daniel was coming from in terms of his faith at the time, and the reign of pagan kingdoms at the time, we come to realize that most of these pagan rulers, which were high priests in their reign, they were the head of their kingdom, and what they did was to sacrifice these animals or their meat to their gods. So they would sacrifice these animals to their pagan gods, and then before they devoured or they ate, that's what they did. And so accordingly, Daniel was coming from a perspective of not only saying we won't be physically, or will be mentally, or will be physically fit, but he was coming from a perspective of this thing defiling his own faith, his own walk and relationship with God. So he was saying, no, I cannot defile myself, I cannot defile this temple, because this temple is the temple of God. Then he was saying, no, I cannot eat these things that are presented to idols before I eat them, of which that's another issue on its own. But for the intent and purpose of this presentation, we'll be looking at it from this perspective and say, he chose to stand up and say, I do not want to eat these things because they are given to pagan god, of which that's not written here, but yes, because of the time of what we are reading here, the timing of when these events were happening, we come to learn that that was actually the influence, one of the influences that Daniel was coming from. He did not want to defile himself with things that were given to pagan gods. But another thing, if I can deduce from from the context of what we are reading, is because yes, and the wine itself was also another source of idol worship as well. So Daniel was coming from that perspective, and he did not want to defile himself. So that's what he purposed in his heart to say, I cannot defile myself, but just a simple meat. And so it was presented in the form of what? Of a test. So God gave him wisdom. He presented it in the form of a test. Born. Let it be this way. So give us a test for 10 days and see how this goes. And then from that point on, then we can judge our appearance and our countenance going forward as to who is better and who is what going forward. So he knew also of the physical attributes that a simple diet had upon his flesh. Nowadays, actually, that's what we're talking about. When people are sick nowadays, actually, before many things, you are actually advised to change your diet. If you intend on losing weight, you don't eat less, but instead you change your diet. You change the fats that you put in your body. You change the sugars that you take in your body. You don't starve yourself, but you substitute, because there are things that we are probably eating that are not good for us in terms of gym. If you want to gain muscle, you eat certain things and you put out other things. So this is the very same benefit that Daniel understood and knew that this simple diet would do for them, and the other not so simple diet or complicated diet had had effects on other people. But yeah, this is where Daniel was coming from. So he presented it as a test. By God's grace, he gave him wisdom to present it as such, and it was done so. And then we read as we follow the narrative, and verse 14 says, so he consented to them in this matter and tested them 10 days, and at the time of 10 days, at the end of the 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the youths who did eat the portion of the king's food. So yes, this is the physical aspect that we just touched upon just now. Thus Melzer took away the portion of their food and wine that they should drink, and give them vegetables. As for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and skill in learning and learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. So yes, now this is now where we are getting into now. This is the background that we are getting into now. This is verse 17. As for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. So we come to see that in as much as we're looking at Old Testament figures like your Joseph, they had understanding in terms of dreams and visions and things like those. But yes, God gave them that wisdom. God gave them skill in terms of learning. I mean, imagine you're coming from a foreign land and now you are forced to learn a new language. It's never an easy process. It takes time and it needs God's intervention. So they were coming from that perspective, and whatever sciences that they had to learn, whatever knowledge that they had to intake, whatever skill that they had to also learn at the time, or the skill of adopting and learning all these other elements that were part of their learning career, God had to intervene and give them the very same understanding. Now we're reading verse 18 and 21. We are about to conclude our session right now. We are about to conclude. Verse 18, it says, and now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king conversed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. Verse 20. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. Verse 21. And Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. So another development here comes to us. So as a result of them keeping a simple lifestyle, a simple vegetable lifestyle, and their discipline, I think the most important part here is their discipline, because now them sticking to principle also says to us that these young men were disciplined in their approach to their faith. So which also says to us our faith needs to have some sort of routine, some sort of discipline that we keep into, so that we might be able to grow. The Bible tells us in the book of Hosea, it says, where there is no vision, the people perish. I'm not sure if it's Hosea or something. Pardon me if I'm making an error there. But it says, where there is no vision, the people perish. In other words, another Bible puts it this way: where there is no what? Vision, the people throw off restraint. So in other words, when there is no direction of some sort, when there is no guidance or vision that directs one to a certain destination, where they have mapped out everything, when that direction is not there, when that map is not there to guide the person, then the person lives their lives willy-nilly, and they do not care sort of about the consequences, because anyway they do not have anything to live for, so they just live according to what their heart dictates. For the Bible tells us that for there is a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof is destruction. This is the book of Proverbs. So this is now what also informs us of the fact that these guys were disciplined. They were disciplined in terms of how they took care of their own life. They took care of their faith. They protected their faith. They did not want mistakes concerning their faith. Another development that we see here also is the king himself actually takes upon himself the responsibility of interviewing these young guys, and he interviews them, and the Bible records that it says, and in the whole land he found none other, or he found them 10 times better than all the other magicians and astrologers which were in the province. That tells us something. And the Bible continues to say, and hence they stayed with the king in the palace. So their discipline, also with their wisdom, their skill that they came with, they added on top of that. They did not leave it there and say, no, we already succeeded, we are good, but they added. Already they were given something, they were given a talent. So those talents that they had, they did not leave them at that point, but their main mission was to sharpen those talents, was to make them as sharp as possible. So when they got to Babylon, along with learning other languages, but they continued sharpening and fine-tuning their craft. So the king brought them and put them in his palace. The king as well was a wise king, we come to learn, because he took a personal decision to have a personal encounter with the young men. He had a personal encounter with them. He sat them down and he interviewed them individually, and he spoke with them. So the king on his own had some degree and some knowledge of what? Of the very same sciences that he was asking them, of the very same astronomy or astrology that he was asking the very same young men. So he could not have asked them from a vacuum. So he knew something about the very same thing that he had been asking these people. So especially for him to have been with the magicians for a long time and the astrologers for a long time. So he knew about all these sciences. He knew about how these ones behave. probably another idea to bring them in was for them to bring a different element that the magicians did not bring to the table throughout his tenure. So yes, so maybe yet while he was with his father for the 2 years, he maybe probably seen that, you know what, there's a bit of a loophole in terms of what these people do, especially considering that he grew up in such a kingdom when he, under his father, he saw all these things happening. So he probably wanted another different dimension. But the king was, in all respects, a wise king. Um, he was not only about harsh, he was not only about, he wanted what was best for these guys, he wanted what was good for them. Hence, he even, I mean, how do you even place captives or slaves in a palace? I mean, if people are captives, they ought to go to prison. But the king decided to say, you know what, I want to, I want to use, I can use with a bit of a hand in a certain department. So he took these boys and he raised them, he groomed them, basically. He mentored them to become people that would later on advise him in terms of how we should do and how we should run the kingdom. So the king was, in all respects, what? Wise. So yeah, brothers and sisters, we come to see as well the character of Daniel, that he stood for principle. It is a very important thing for us to stand for principle, in as much as we might find ourselves in what? In tatters, in even as much as we might find ourselves amidst flames, even if we might find ourselves amidst, you know, all these situations that seem to be troublous to us. But it is important to stick to what? To principle, because the very same principle is the one that sustains us, is the very same principle that grows us, is the very same principle that that God is talking about, or as Ezekiel is talking about when he's talking about the righteousness of who? Of Daniel and Noah. And so these people, though in some respects when they stand for principle, we view them as being crazy people, but the very same principle is the one that guides them, is the very same principle that shapes their lives and that molds their lives. And as they stand, they grow stronger and stronger. So that is the background and probably the introduction of Daniel. So in our next session, in our next episode, we'll be looking at chapter 2. This is now when the dream, when the king dreams a dream and Daniel interprets the very same dream. So we know that Daniel was a prophet, and the very same Matthew 24 talks about when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, spoken of by the prophet Daniel. Let him who read understand. So this is the very same dream that we'll be looking at. So just prepare your mind around those areas as we'll be taking on Daniel chapter 2 in our next session. For now, remember that the name of the program is Hidden Figures. So don't forget also to subscribe and then to get the latest from Hidden Figures. And yeah, from me, your presenter, your host, Lisiba Manyelo. Bye for now.